Hello, nerds. Welcome to another episode of the History and Nerds United podcast. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we have guest Kevin Birmingham, author of The Sinner and the Saint, Dostoevsky and the Gentleman Murderer Who Inspired a Masterpiece. Listen, if you're freaking out because you hear the name Dostoevsky and you think, oh no, they're going to make me read Crime and Punishment again. Nope, not at all. Kevin's book is about how Dostoevsky ended up writing Crime and Punishment. You don't have to remember a thing about Crime and Punishment to enjoy the book. It's really good. We also talked to Kevin about his first book, The Most Dangerous Book, about Ulysses. He does quote some things that happen in Ulysses that are not safe for work. So just be careful if you're listening around the kiddies. And he also talks about winning an award, the Truman Capote Award for the most dangerous book. And I actually talked to him about his speech while accepting the award. He said some things that were a little bit controversial. I was really interested to talk to him about it. He was very open about it. And I appreciate Kevin being on this episode, diving into everything. It came out great. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to shut up now. Let's get to Kevin Birmingham. Author Kevin Birmingham, thank you for coming to the podcast. Really appreciate to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So a little background on you. We're going to talk about your second book, The Sinner and the Saint, today. But your first book did pretty well itself. It's called The Most Dangerous Book. Can you tell me just a little bit about that one?
Yeah, The Most Dangerous Book is about the fight to publish James Joyce's Ulysses, which was banned as obscene for over a decade in the United States. What that meant was that if you tried to sell a copy of Ulysses in the 1920s or early 30s, you could potentially go to prison for it. If you tried to send it across state lines, that was illegal. If you advertised it in newspapers, that was also problematic. So the book is really the story of Joyce's struggle to write the book and the people who were trying to get the book banned. There were vice societies, both in the United States and in Britain, who were opposed to sexually explicit books. And that, I should say, is the reason why Ulysses was deemed obscene, because there are several sexually explicit scenes. Even by today's standards, there are some moments in Ulysses that are somewhat shocking, including, for example, a transgender moment where Leopold Bloom, the protagonist of Ulysses, turns into a woman in a phantasmagoric scene in a brothel at around midnight in Dublin and is fisted in front of a group of onlookers in the brothel and then sold off as a sex slave. So it was published in 1922. This year is the centenary of Ulysses and the publication of Ulysses, specifically on February 2nd. And writing something like that was explicitly beyond the pale, beyond what you could legally publish in the United States and in the UK. The First Amendment was never really successfully invoked to protect a novel. Our current readings of the First Amendment really stem from the 1950s and 60s. So for someone to try to appeal to First Amendment protections in order to be able to publish a book, that was considered just completely not what the First Amendment was for. So the book, takes place in Paris, where Joyce was writing, and he was living in Trieste in Italy before that. A lot of it takes place in London. It's sort of like a snapshot of transatlantic modernism from the 1910s to the 1930s, told through the story of what happens to a single book.
And I find that interesting. I'd have to look it up, but I'm thinking 1920s US, you could probably still mail opium and cocaine and everything like that.
Right.
But Ulysses, that's probably too much. You couldn't send that one. That is too far.
Right. The strictures against sexually explicit material were pretty strict, and even more so than, even today, we have the vestiges of that in Hollywood, where if you want to have an incredibly violent movie or a movie that features drug use from start to finish, that's totally fine. But if you want to have a sexually explicit scene in that movie, suddenly it's going to be rated NC-17. It's going to be very difficult to distribute. So Americans historically have been quite all right with drug abuse and with violence, but have been very draconian when it comes to sexually explicit material.
I don't like feeling prudish, but I guess that's where we're at right now. You actually won an award for your first book, which was the Truman Capote Award. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, how does that even happen, right? Does somebody just call you up and said, hey, we submitted the book and it turns out you won something? Or is there a lot of work behind that on your side of things?
Yeah, no, literally someone just called me up. And in fact, I was at lunch with one of your former guests, Matthew Pearl, when I got that phone call. And I think I didn't answer the phone, and then they sent me an email, and I had no idea what it was about. And the Truman Capote Award is given to, as the award itself states, a work of excellent literary criticism published within the last 4 years. So it takes a little while for literary criticism to percolate out into the world. And there is a panel of judges, and each of those judges submits 2 books for consideration. And so I believe there are a total of 10 or 12 books that are under consideration, and each panel member votes on which one they think is the best. So it's a completely closed process. You can't apply for it. I was not aware that I was nominated for it. I just got a phone call one day and was happy to learn that I had won, and realized after the fact that I was the first one to win for a first book. So, most of the people who are winning the award are scholars who have been tenured for decades in some cases, maybe in most cases. And so I considered it quite an honor, and I considered it, in a way, what I was happy about was that it was recognition within the Academy for a book that was not written for the Academy. That, my book, The Most Dangerous Book, was written for a popular audience, both for, maybe I should say, what they call a crossover audience, both for people who have been reading James Joyce their entire lives, or for people who have never read Ulysses, or maybe read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man when they were in college 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And I'm trying to bring both of those audiences together. And I'm trying to shed some light into the inner workings of a novel and the cultural reception of a novel, not through argumentation primarily, but through storytelling. And you would think that storytelling would not be something that a bunch of English professors would resist. But historically, in the Academy, it's been very difficult for people who are telling stories as a way to explicate narratives to get published, to get hired, to get promoted, to get all the professional rewards that come with the typical career. I hope that it opened the door for future scholars and for current grad students to start to explore new ways to write their dissertations, because dissertations are generally awful things. They tend to be 6 chapters written about 6 books, and they have a distinct argument for each chapter, and they're dutifully written, and some of them are really wonderful, but the form is also can be a trap. And I came up with the idea for The Most Dangerous Book while I was finishing my own dissertation, which was about a very different subject. And I was just sick of it. I was just sick of writing it. I was fed up with writing typical academic prose. And so I came up with a proposal for a completely different type of book. And about 2 months after I got my PhD, I got a contract. And so instead of working on turning my dissertation into a book, I just decided I'm going to run with this and write the book that I wanted to write. And it ended up being The Most Dangerous Book. It ended up being, for the first time, I should say, with writing, something that made me very happy. I felt that I had an audience, and I felt that I was contributing something important. And I didn't need the Academy to do it. I could do it on my own. And, my life and my career has taken an abrupt turn, since then.
And I read your speech when you accepted the award, and I found it really interesting. It's something that not a lot of people know. You, in effect, kind of call out the system, right? Which I don't think a lot of people, understand. And I don't know if you can, summarize it in a better way that I can, but that you're talking about the dissertations and doing this. And, a lot of authors, they also have to be working at a college at the same time, or honestly, like doing 2 or 3 other jobs, whatever they can. And in your speech, you kind of call out the system. Can you kind of dive into that just a little bit for the audience?
Yeah, so the award is given the University of Iowa, and I was told beforehand that I was to give a speech, and it could be about any subjects related to literary criticism. And I thought, okay, this is a pretty wide range of things I can talk about. And I thought, well, to be honest, the most important issue facing literary criticism is the fact that all of the people who are trying to be literary critics are more or less exploited by the way the Academy is structured. Any English department that has PhD students is taking on the number of PhD students that they need in order to get the teaching and the grading done within that department. They're not taking on the number of students that the job market can actually handle. So what happens is you have an incredible glut of PhD candidates every year being minted, and they're all looking for jobs, and those jobs just don't exist. So for any one position, there will be hundreds and hundreds of applicants. And, in any given field, in any year, there may be 5 to 10 jobs in that field if you're lucky. Now, when 90% of your students can't get jobs, you need to start to rethink the number of graduate students you're taking into your program. And you need to start to rethink how labor is distributed in the scholarly field. And the only way out of it is for tenured faculty members to dramatically increase the amount that they are teaching and reducing the amount that they are writing, so that they aren't relying upon PhD students to run discussion sections and to grade papers and, to fill up seminars that are going to lead to degrees that can't be used. It's a little bit of a bait and switch where a lot of PhD students enter a program and they're not fully aware of the long odds of getting a job. I should say, I think that's changing. I think it's much more clear now than it was maybe in 2015 or 2016 that, everyone thinks that they're going to be the exception to the rule, that they're going to get a job. But of course, they're not. Most people are not the exception to the rule, they're the rule. And while I do think that you, as a potential grad student, should take responsibility for your own life and your own decisions, I think institutions definitely need to take responsibility for the decisions that they're making. If we were able to reduce the amount of suffering and wasted years that all of these young PhD students endure looking for jobs and failing to get them, that would be great. And, in the humanities, we as humanists sometimes present ourselves as being the people who are able to treat other human beings with compassion. I don't know if that's true or not, but a lot of humanists see themselves at the very least as being different from people on Wall Street, right? That they're not, Wall Street capitalists. They are in the academy because they have different values. But when you see how the business of the humanities is run and how the business of universities is run, they're not any different. In fact, you could argue that they're worse because at least the Wall Street capitalists are quite frank about what they want. They just want to make money. And, there's a potential hypocrisy that's happening within the humanities that really needs to be called out. And I took, the speech as an opportunity to talk about that.
I mean, it came out great, and it's actually now the perfect segue to start talking about the sinner and the saint, because it sounds like there was a lot of philosophy kind of behind that and how things should be done. And the sinner and the saint, about Dostoevsky writing Crime and Punishment and how he was inspired to do that by an actual real-life murderer. But the first part of your book, which I found interesting, which is just these kind of treatises on a lot of the philosophies of that time and what they were. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to lie to you, the first few pages, I'm like, oh no, I bought a philosophy book. I didn't know that. I need to turn around and go back. But it's very quickly, it's clear that you're just kind of saying, hey, here's the baseline before I get into the history and start walking through this man's life. I just found it really interesting. It seemed like, at least from the way you frame it, philosophy at that time was life. People identified themselves by what their philosophy was. Is that really kind of what it was like back then, or was that more for the higher thinking folks?
No, people took philosophy very seriously in 1860s Russia, and it was a substitute to some degree for explicit political engagement, because being explicitly political was not acceptable in 1860s Russia because the Tsar didn't want it. So a lot of the energy that would have gone into politics at the time was channeled into philosophy and into literature. So, part of the reason why we have this explosion of wonderful literature in Russia in the middle of the 19th century is because it was what you did when you couldn't be explicitly political. So The Sinner and the Saint, my book about Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, is in some ways similar to The Most Dangerous Book in that I'm taking the biography of a single book, what happens with a single book, and using it as a lens to see a larger moment in history. And in this case, the larger moment is the emergence of revolutionary thinking both in Western Europe and in Russia. And to read Crime and Punishment is to read a novel about a young man who is, I suppose you could say, down on his luck, but he's impoverished. He has dropped out of law school. His family is in the provinces, so he's alone effectively. He has one friend left. He lives in a small room, which is described, variously as a cupboard or a coffin. And he's resentful of the fact that life has treated him this way when he feels as if he deserves something much more. Raskolnikov decides to kill a pawnbroker. And the official stated reason for that is that pawnbrokers are people who feast upon the misfortune of others, right? They charge exorbitant interest for people who have nothing left and are giving their last prized possession to someone for a small amount of time because they have no other choice. And Raskolnikov thinks, well, what if we take a pawnbroker who is really a parasite on society, someone who is just cruel and opportunistic? What if I were to kill a pawnbroker and take her money and use that money for benevolent purposes? Wouldn't that be a net gain for society? So he goes to her apartment. He has an axe hidden inside of his coat, and he kills her. He goes into her bedroom, starts rifling through a trunk with the pawned objects and some money hidden, and then hears a noise in the front room, goes out and sees that the pawnbroker's sister is there. He wasn't expecting her to be there. And so suddenly he has to kill her as well. And so now he's killed two people. He ends up getting away. We know that he's the murderer at part one of the novel. So it's not a murder mystery. It's a thriller instead. The drama of Crime and Punishment is we know Raskolnikov has killed someone. But the question is, why does he do it? And there's this long back and forth, repeated encounters with an inspector. And the inspector is a model for Columbo. If you've ever seen Columbo, he's sort of like shambling figure, and he wears this like trench coat, and he asks questions. He seems dumbfounded. He's not really on top of things, you don't think. But then every now and then he'll ask a very incisive question, and you have to wonder, when you're the criminal, if he's really far off base or if he knows exactly what's going on. And that uncertainty is something that rattles Raskolnikov, and it gets under his skin. The inspector doesn't have any evidence, any physical evidence against Raskolnikov. So the only way that Raskolnikov is going to be brought to justice is if he confesses. And so the novel is about this path, the circuitous path that Raskolnikov takes towards his own confession. Along the way, he has a lot of excuses that he gives for killing the pawnbrokers. One of them was the utilitarian idea, where, if you kill one bad person and then create good for 10 other people or 100 other people, then if it's a net good, then it's an okay thing to do. But there's several other philosophical defenses that he trots out. Ultimately, though, if you read Crime and Punishment and you come away thinking that Raskolnikov has killed for philosophical purposes, that means that he has successfully eluded being captured by you. That means that he's fooled you. Because the truth is that Raskolnikov kills just out of a sheer compulsion for destructiveness. He feels trapped by life, and Dostoevsky gets that there's a thrill to wiping everything away, towards, destroying not only other people, but also yourself. The idea that, you might destroy your own life can, in a way, be thrilling. It's like jumping off of a cliff, and this moment before gravity takes hold where you feel free just for a split second. Dostoevsky saw that there were some people who would trade everything just for a moment of that freedom. And so Crime and Punishment is very much a novel about the allure of that self-destruction.
And first thing is first, I do want to thank you that it's not required to read Crime and Punishment before reading your book. I feel like it's a Marvel movie, right? If you've seen the ones before it, you'll capture a few extra things that somebody else wouldn't.
That's right.
But you can go into this. I mean, I'm not sure if I was forced to read Crime and Punishment in high school, but I know I don't remember it. But what I find very interesting, and tell me if you did this on purpose, it's not a full biography of Dostoevsky. Like, you skip around a little bit, but
no.
What I didn't realize until you got to the part where he starts writing Crime and Punishment is all of the things you talked about were almost requirements for Dostoevsky to even begin writing Crime and Punishment. You talk about him being sent to Siberia for political purposes. You talk about how just he is constantly poor, constantly just trying, he has nothing. And the other thing I just had no idea about is how important journals were at this time in Russia, which was, I mean, that was the medium that everybody got everything from, right? Because, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's nothing. It's very funny because my absolute favorite part of your book is that you also look at all of the things Dostoevsky ended up not using, or how, because it was a journal and it came out in episodes, basically, he had time to think through, and you actually looked through everything and saw that, oh, hey, at one point, the inspector thought it was him, but it was a figment of his imagination. He was making stuff up in his head, but then he changed it. Did you find a lot of that when looking at Dostoevsky's stuff, that just, he was a bit all over the place, and then he came to this middle path?
Yeah. I mean, a part of what, interested me about this story is the entire creative process that Dostoevsky went through while coming up with the idea for the novel, and how the novel was changing as it was unspooling, as it was being published, month after month in the Russian Herald. So, the idea at first was somewhat simple. In fact, he thought of it as being, a long short story, something around the order of 90 to 100 pages. And it just grew and grew very quickly. The notion, for example, of the way that the book is told, it's told through, what we would consider an attached third person, or it's a very intimate third-person perspective. It's almost as if we're hovering over Raskolnikov's shoulder as he walks up the stairwell, as he brings the axe out, as he has fever dreams, as he's confused, as he's scared, as he's hallucinating. That wasn't his first idea for the book. Dostoevsky initially thought that he was going to write it as a confession in a diary, that he was going to be writing a diary and telling about a crime that he committed years ago. And then he thought, no, this isn't quite right because it's too distant. So then he considered that it would be a confession on the stand, on a witness stand at his own trial, to bring all of us a little bit closer to the murders. And he thought, that's also too distant. The more Dostoevsky thought about it, the more he wanted to be with the murderer from start to finish. And it was a difficult thing to do, partly because it wasn't easy to describe murders in published materials. It could very easily have been censored. And when you read the murder scene in Crime and Punishment, it's a graphic murder scene. And people were shocked at the time to read a murder scene like this, to see the blood spilling out of this old woman's head. People were getting sick when they read it. They were appalled. Some people were outraged. So when Dostoevsky was writing this and taking a murder story and telling it from a murderer's perspective, that was an uncommon thing to do. And the intimacy with which he gets into the mind of Raskolnikov is something that reverberates out in literature, in Western literature, not just in Russia, through the next, 40 to 50 years. And then, eventually we do get to something like James Joyce's Ulysses, where it's stream of consciousness. But the ancestor to these modernist experiments was really, a lot of the free and direct discourse, the sort of intimate, over-the-shoulder looks that we get from writers like Dostoevsky.
And it's the other part of the book, of course, is that last piece to inspire Dostoevsky, which is Pierre-François Lassanière, an actual French murderer that he read about. My first thought was, okay, people complain about people loving true crime too much right now, but it turns out true crime's been a big deal for a long time. You talk about it in the book. Lassanière becomes a big deal in the papers. Dostoevsky reads about him. And while there's a lot of similarities in the murder, the two characters could not be more different, because Lassanière, he seemed to kind of capture that zeitgeist because he was seemingly really smart and he wrote stuff and everything. But when you look at his whole life, he just really seems like a sociopath. It wasn't about any of that stuff. He just was a bad seed. Is that kind of what you saw him as?
Yeah, I would agree with that. So The Sinner and the Saint tells two stories. It's the story of Dostoevsky as a young writer and how he was imprisoned in Siberia, how he had encountered criminals and murderers, how he learned from those murderers, how he was captivated by their stories, how he came back to European Russia, back to St. Petersburg, and effectively restarted his career in the 1860s. And then, over a 10-year period, had the most tremendous years of his life. But it's also the story of Pierre-François Lassanière, who was a murderer in Paris in the 1830s. And Dostoevsky was always on the lookout for murder stories, was always captivated by true crime, as you say, and captivated by real things and looking for how the actual world could be a model for his fictional world. He was not interested in stories that didn't seem to be pressingly relevant to what was going on in Russia at that moment. And so searching through newspapers was something he did quite frequently. He was starting a magazine with his brother in 1861, and he came across the story of Lacenaire. And Lacenaire was involved in a double homicide. The double homicide involved an axe, supposed to be used for seed money. They were going to rob this man and his widowed mother in order to take their money and then use that money for a bank robbery scheme. And the bank robbery scheme involved stealing money from collection clerks at banks. And the reason why they needed money for that is because they needed to rent an apartment and furniture in order to get the clerks to go up into those apartments. And they needed to look like they were the apartments of people who were somewhat wealthy and who had direct business to do with these banks. He was soon arrested for these crimes. And what was astonishing, there were a few things that were astonishing. The first was that Lacenaire seemed very casual about the crimes that he committed. He said, "I kill a man as I drink a glass of wine. It doesn't really matter to me." But he also enjoyed an incredible amount of celebrity in Paris at the time. When the crimes were committed and when they were publicized, what people were struck by was that Lacenaire was educated. He was handsome. He was eloquent. He wrote poetry. He also wanted to be a lawyer. He also wrote about the criminal justice system, the way Raskolnikov does. He wasn't the way criminals were thought to have been. At the time, people were referring to the criminal classes or the dangerous classes, right? These were people who were supposed to be separate from the normal human being. They were supposed to look different. They were supposed to be uneducated. They were supposed to be poor. And here was a man who came from a bourgeois family. It was a bourgeois family that had lost its fortune just before he, was going to inherit it himself. And he seemed, to be talented and to be literate and literary. And this was not the way a criminal was supposed to be. And so when his trial took place, crowds had come to see it. There were many women sitting in the front rows to the chagrin of the press. All these press accounts talk about how appalling it was that fancy women were fawning over Lacenaire and his good looks and his style. He was wearing a blue frock coat. And, when he died, a wax likeness of his bust was put on display in a museum, and crowds of people came to see it. One of his hands was severed and mummified, and that mummified hand also made the rounds in Paris. And so he had this long afterlife, and that afterlife is partly because he wrote his own memoirs in between the time of his trial and the time that he was guillotined. He didn't have a chance to finish it, but he wrote about 80 to 90 pages. And when I discovered those 80 to 90 pages, that's when I realized I have enough material for a book, that this is actually two stories, that we can tell the story of Lacenaire. And in the book, Lacenaire, and just in interviews and at the trial and so forth, Lacenaire portrays himself as someone who is murdering for ideological purposes. And, he was basically, claiming to avenge the wrongs of an unjust society. He says, "I come to preach the religion of fear to the rich, for the religion of love has no power over their hearts." He wanted to present himself as someone who was going to steal from banks because the banks were unjust, and that he was effectively a revolutionary. At the time, this was quite disturbing because in 1830s Paris, we're about 12 to 13 years before the 1848 revolutions that are about to sweep not only Paris, but really all of Europe. Almost every capital of Europe, saw major disruptions and riots, people protesting for general assemblies, for legislative assemblies, for constitutions. People wanted to overthrow monarchies. And a lot of this revolutionary fervor was starting to bubble up in the philosophy of the late 1700s and early 1800s. And there was a detail in Lacenaire's crimes that all of the press seized upon. When he was waiting for one of his victims to come up to the decoy apartment that was the trap, he was sitting outside calmly reading Rousseau's Social Contract. this was a signal to French readers at the time that, oh, he's reading Rousseau. He's, anti-monarchy. He's opposed to the king. Now, Rousseau wasn't really a firebrand at all, but in French memory at the time, he was associated with Robespierre and with, the Reign of Terror. And it's true that Lacenaire was opposed to the king, and he was opposed to authority in general and was opposed to the way that society worked. Though the truth is that beneath all that was really just a base desire for money and for self-destruction. And that's what Dostoevsky took from Lacenaire, is that there's an idea of an ideological murderer, someone who presents himself as murdering for some higher philosophical purpose. But beneath all of that is a murder for no real reason whatsoever. Raskolnikov, when he ultimately confesses to his love interest, finally confesses the true reason for doing what he's done. And he says, I did it just to take everything by the tail and whisk it off to the devil, just to destroy it. And Dostoevsky saw that there were a lot of young radicals, they called themselves nihilists in Russia at the time, who took a pleasure in just wiping everything away, in destroying the way the entire system worked, in destroying not only the Tsar, but Tsarism in general, in destroying the bureaucratic system, in destroying the landholders, and creating what he called a tabula rasa in order to construct a paradise. He thought they were fools for wanting to create a paradise, but he did realize that there was a pleasure just in starting over. And he was embedding that pleasure of destructiveness in Raskolnikov the same way that he saw the pleasure of destructiveness in Lacenaire.
And it's very interesting because all of that, as I'm reading it, is you read Crime and Punishment and everything that happened. Everything had to happen to Dostoevsky for him to understand how to write that, right? Like he wasn't quite fully radical, but before he was sent off to Siberia, he was really dabbling in a lot of different philosophies, goes to Siberia, and, in real life, he almost seems, a bit chastised. He comes back and he's not nearly as much of a zealot when it comes to these philosophies, but he needed to go to Siberia. He needed to be somewhat of a radical and then have something happen to him for him to come back and say, hey, this is what I'm going to write for you to kind of show you that you can believe in things, but if you take them too far, you're just destroying everything.
Right. Dostoevsky, when he was young, he was very much opposed to serfdom. And to be opposed to serfdom in the late 1840s when he was arrested was a very dangerous thing to be. And so he was interested in socialism a little bit. He was interested in what's considered to be radical or liberal philosophy, things that the Tsar just could not accept, which is, he was part of a reading group of people who were interested in these reformist ideas. And that's why they were all rounded up and arrested very suddenly. He thought he was going to be executed. They actually took these men out into a square in the middle of St. Petersburg and tied the first three men to stakes, put hoods over their heads. And the firing squad was aiming the rifles when at the very last minute, the Tsar's envoy gallops into the square and announces that the Tsar, in his infinite mercy, is going to spare their lives. And instead of being executed, Dostoevsky and his cohort, they were going to be sentenced and exiled to Siberia for, in Dostoevsky's case, it was, almost a decade.
And for context, the Tsar at this time is actually one of the more liberal Tsars that we ever saw.
Right. Yeah. Well, so it straddles a couple of different regimes. So Tsar Nicholas was the one who arrested him, but then it was Alexander II who, when Dostoevsky came back to Petersburg in 1860, Alexander II was the Tsar. It was still not very easy to just say candidly what you wanted to say, but the days were numbered for serfdom, and the official decree was handed down in 1861. So Dostoevsky could rest easy, at least thinking to himself, the stain of serfdom has now been washed away. Like the Russian Empire, whatever its faults may be, was no longer resting upon this brutal system. And he looked back upon his own youth as just being stupidity. The fact that how could he possibly have thought that he and his friends were going to overthrow the economic system of an entire empire? It was so stupid, he thought. And he had nearly ruined his entire life. And he spent, years in a Siberian prison. And day after day after day, he felt his life was being stolen from him. And he blamed himself for that as well, that it was stupidity. And so when the next generation of radicals was coming of age in the 1860s, he could sympathize with what they wanted. He could see that, what they wanted was what was best, what they thought would be best for the Russian Empire and for the Russian people. A lot of them were socialists, and they wanted to, even though serfdom was on the way out, the peasants were not exactly in a great position economically or socially. And he could see that they wanted more radical change than the czars were willing to offer. And as the 1860s wore on, the divide within Russian society was widening, where conservatives were getting more conservatives and radicals were getting more radical. And Dostoevsky is trying to hold a middle ground a little bit. It's getting more and more difficult. So when he writes Crime and Punishment, he's writing it in the midst of this split in Russian society, where he's trying to show the folly of radicalism. He's trying to show the folly of when young people want to reason their way to a better world rather than having a basic feeling for that better world. But the thing is that, Raskolnikov is not a villain. He's not an awful person. He really does have sympathy for people. And the novel makes that clear. The problem for Raskolnikov is when he ignores that basic feeling for goodness and tries to reason his way towards goodness. And, for Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment was a way to warn Russians about being swept away by Western ideas, by being swept away by some intellectual version of how society should be run, and in forgetting the feeling for goodness for the people around you, which is what he thought was most important. If goodness doesn't come from the bottom up, if it comes from the top down instead, it's going to topple and it's going to be catastrophic. That was part of his reasoning. It was a difficult message for people to accept because if you were liberal, liberals and radicals saw this as a scathing attack upon radicals in general. Like, oh, Dostoevsky is claiming that any radical is a murderer. That wasn't exactly the case, but it's easy to see how the nuances of the novel would have gotten lost in a polarizing environment.
I mean, he had a lot of time to think through all of this stuff when he got sent to Siberia, exiled, which your book does probably the best I've ever seen of explaining how much it would suck to get sent to Siberia. Because a lot of times it's just mentioned, oh, they got sent to Siberia, and you think, oh, they're in the middle of nowhere. That's very cold. Yeah. You actually take us through, hey, they got to get themselves to Siberia. And Dostoevsky was actually lucky because he had a sled.
Right.
The most amazing fact in your book was that some people were forced to walk to Siberia, and it could literally take them years to get into exile, depending on how they got there.
Right. And if you were exiled for a decade, let's say, and you were sent to Kamchatka, to the Pacific, you had to walk all the way from, let's say, Moscow or St. Petersburg to the Pacific. And your sentence didn't start until you got there. So if it took you years to walk there, 10 years, the clock didn't start until your arrival. And, a lot of people died along the way. You also had to walk in chains and fetters. And Dostoevsky was wearing fetters for years. And it was a reminder that, you belonged to the Tsar and you were supposed to be subservient and obedient. Some of these convicts had their faces branded. Their crimes were literally branded on their faces to let anyone know who happened to see them that this is a criminal. So if they tried to escape and anyone saw them on a highway or something like that, they would know not to give them shelter or not to help them, or in fact, to try to turn them in. It was a brutal regime, though, Russians would say at the same time, there's virtually no capital punishment in Russia. Instead of executing people, normally what we do is we send them to Siberia, and that's, a more humane way of dealing with it. So it's debatable, I suppose.
It's very relative, but between Dickens and Dostoevsky, I want nothing to do with the 1800s anywhere, it sounds like. But what are you going to do? One of the things I like to do in the podcast is the overall intent is to take somebody who normally doesn't read history and say to them, you're missing out. If you had somebody who said, listen, I don't read history, your book is history, why should I bother reading it? What would you say?
Well, I think my answer is probably similar to what most people would say, which is that, to read carefully about a distant subject is to shed light on what's happening right now in a roundabout way, and to do it in a way that leaves people a little bit off their guard a bit, because, we're living through, for example, a pretty charged moment where everyone feels a certain way about the pandemic and about vaccines and about mask mandates and things like that. And we already have our guard up and we know how we feel and we're locked into this way of thinking. When you start to read a story about something distant, you start to realize how people can behave a certain way, and you have some sort of access to the truth. The truth sort of springs upon you when you're not looking, or when you are looking, but you're looking, it springs upon you from another direction. So I guess, to be a little bit more specific, I think Dostoevsky knew that human beings were irrational. He knew that they did things all the time that was contrary to their own interests. He knew that they didn't work for the maximization of their own happiness. He knew that they had contrary impulses, and he knew that those impulses could very easily tear society apart. For anyone who is a student of Dostoevsky, to see what has gone on in this country and around the world with the divisions that have taken place, with our awful response to a pandemic, with our response to just basic facts and how we process those basic facts and how we deny those basic facts, none of that would be very surprising to anyone who has read Dostoevsky. To see our self-destructive responses is something very much in keeping with Dostoevsky's vision of how human nature works.
So I think Dostoevsky would kind of tell everybody, calm the hell down. All right, we're all human. We figure it out. Just don't get too charged up, and also don't get so in love with your own philosophy that you're kind of detaching from life per se.
Yeah, I think especially that point about not being so in love with your own philosophy, that you can get lost in these ideas, and that getting lost in these ideas and ideologies is a point of danger. Raskolnikov's danger was ignoring his feeling for fellow human beings as individuals and in imagining a loftier version of himself who would effectively be a hero and do good for society. Now, doing good for society was in a way a cover for a sort of egoism, right? And, egoism as a philosophy was, sweeping mid-19th century Europe and Russia. And what egoism ultimately meant was a denial of the exterior world, that facts were meaningless unless you as an individual made them meaningful. And if you wanted to deny them, you could go ahead and deny them. Other people became meaningless unless you as an individual wanted to make them meaningful, unless they meant something to you. And it's a sort of perverted idea of individualism that was coming to the forefront, where, democracy spawned this, and the Enlightenment spawned these notions of individualism that were important and remain important, but it can very easily spin into something that is a perverse, grotesque caricature. And that grotesque caricature is the egoist who can deny everything and can wipe everything away as casually as he or she wishes.
Okay, Kevin, I ask every author this. All right, you're an award-winning author, very smart guy. I think there's been at least 2 words that I'm going to have to Google later that you said, but that's okay. I'll take care of it. You talked about the pandemic. We've been locked down a lot. Everything's going crazy. What is the trashy TV that you've been watching while locked into your house? Will you admit it, and will you name the actual shows?
Let's see, the trash. I like a lot of reality TV. In fact, my fiance still remains shocked that I watched so much reality television. One of the shows that we watched when it first came out was Love is Blind. And there was a recent update to Love is Blind. I said, we have to watch the update. I need to see what happened with some of these people. So we watched that, and she sort of begrudgingly accepts my interest in reality television, but it's not all trashy. I think the last show that we both really loved was White Lotus.
Very good. Love that one too. Yeah.
It's a great show. I'm an unabashed consumer of reality TV. It's not the only thing I watch, but it's probably not Dostoevskian. I think what it is that, I'm usually reading heavy things, sometimes serious things. And when I want to relax, I want to do the complete opposite.
Listen, I'm just proud of you that you leaned right into it. A lot of people would have said, oh, the fiance loves Love is Blind, and she made me sit there and read it while I was going through this and that. But no, you did it. Fantastic, Kevin. Listen, thanks for being on. Really appreciate you coming.
Hey, thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode of History Nerds United podcast. Thank you, Kevin Birmingham, for coming on. Everybody, just try and find us wherever you can. HistoryNerdsUnited.com, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're all over the place. We've got a lot of great stuff coming out. Hope you come along for the ride. Hey, if you're out there buying anything on Amazon, do us a favor. Head over to HistoryNerdsUnited.com, click on our Amazon banner. It's a couple extra clicks for you. You're not getting charged any extra money, but Amazon gives us a kickback so that we can give you more history goodness. Anyway, see you next time. Bye, nerds.